At the age of 14, she began to hear the voices. They floated deep in her ear when she first slipped into slumber, a low drone like insects. As the year passed, the wavering drone began to settle into a single tone, a soft, perfect hum that would lull her into the most beautiful of dreams. Over the next year, her 15th, the voice became discernible. The tone turned into a timbre. The words became sentences. The hum became a voice and a song. It was low and quiet, a soft masculine voice that whispered a passionate confession, both scared and enwrapped. It spoke of love and protection. It promised her gardens and fountains, jewels and gowns, music and dancing. Halfway through her 15th year, she began to talk in her sleep. To her mother, it was only a mumble, but deep inside her mind, they were words, powerful words. Will you love me forever? Yes. Will you never leave me? Yes. Will you trust me? Yes. She promised her heart and her soul. She promised the blood that fed her and the flesh that shaped her. Then she would dream of a slender golden thread being taken from somewhere deep inside her body, a thread tied to every promise she made. It was the first week after her 16th birthday that she heard the voice during the day. She was walking alone in the woods that surrounded the village when it floated up the back of her neck, a soft whisper of her name, like a warm hand running its fingers through her hair. She smiled, and it faded away. But it came back, each day a little stronger. Soon it was just as present in her wakeful hours as it was in her slumber, but only when she was alone. I will come for you, he promised. I am waiting, she replied. She would spend as much time as possible alone just so she could hear him talk. He told her that he was coming for her, only to be with her, and that once he found her, he would never leave. Her family, however, was growing worried. It was wrong for a girl her age to spend so much time alone. She should be with the other children, but she seemed so happy it was difficult to approach her. Her older brother took that task upon himself and began to tease her. He would tell her that she was going to turn into an old maid, some wandering lunatic, unwashed and rambling, and that all the villagers would fear her and children would run away from her. She said she didn't care. She walked through the trees for hours as the voice told her of his love for her and all the wonderful things he would do for her, as long as she had faith and believed in him. Outside of the sanctity of her isolation, her family grew more concerned. Her friends became more distant, and her brother became harsher. She began to doubt. Perhaps she was deluded. Then, the voice disappeared. For 3 days she stood in the woods, alone and empty, straining through the silence to find even a whisper of her distant love. As night fell on the 3rd day, the darkness brought a hollow sadness that began to cut at her. She lowered her head, heavy with swelling tears, and began to walk home. Then she heard her name. It was the voice, but it was different. It sounded fuller, deeper. She raised her head and heard it again, and she realized the voice was not floating somewhere deep in the dark space of her mind. It was right behind her. She turned, and there he stood, tall, bright, real. He smiled. She would have fainted if she weren't so overwhelmed by her desire to touch him, to feel him, and he stood there. They sat and touched each other's faces for an hour in the dark. The moon barely allowed for a silhouette in the shadows, but it was enough to touch. He told her he had traveled so far and done so much only to be here right now. He would tell her about it someday, but now she should go home. It was late, and her family would worry. She wanted him to come back with her, to meet her family. He declined. He said that the time was not yet right. He made her promise that she would tell no one about him. He said that she would understand later, but now he needed her trust. She was confused, but she loved him. They agreed to meet the next day, alone, far from the village. And so this went on for nearly a month. During the afternoons, she would sneak away from her family and meet him in the woods. Sometimes they would walk, sometimes they would sit, sometimes they would talk, sometimes they were silent for the entire day. Sometimes they would laugh. Once she cried. Sometimes they would just hold each other and shake in awe of the other's existence. But they were always happy, and she always had to leave. She felt like a boat pulled out of the water and set on the shore, always hungering the sea, always desiring the purpose it was designed for. Her family, however, was not happy. Their concern blossomed into fear. They pushed in quiet, gentle ways, trying to get her to join the society that she shunned, trying to find out why she avoided the village so much, why she was always alone. They were afraid that their prying would set her off, so they were always careful, except for her brother. His concern was true, but it was hidden beneath his cruel mannerisms and humor. He would tease her viciously, and even though it was out of care, it hurt her. It was during dinner, when her brother had just finished painting a wild and vivid picture of her old and lonely life, ragged hair, gnarled hands, and empty, tearful eyes, that rained out her loneliness in a world that no longer cared for her, that she burst. She cried out this would never happen because she had found someone more beautiful than anyone in this town could ever imagine, and she ran off to her room. The next morning she slipped out before any of her family awoke, but her brother crept after her without her knowledge. She went into the woods and waited. Her lover arrived long after her tears had finished staining the ground, but from the marks in the dirt, he knew she was hurt. She began to tell him about her family and what she had done when her brother stepped out from behind a tree. He began to scream, "That monster! That monster!" She turned to look at the man. He looked sad. His hand began to move. Lines appeared in the skin. Small patches began to separate, like a quilt being undone. Thin rays of light began to leak out from the gaps. As the small patches fell apart, the light grew more brilliant. Violent rays of hot luminance shot out. His face began to fall, revealing nothing but a white light. Her eyes began to burn. She turned her head away and saw her brother. He stared with anger and fury at the man, poised to attack. The light fell onto his face. It pierced his eyes. He drew back in pain, howling as he tried to cover his face. His eyes began to steam and melt, and he collapsed on the ground with smoke pouring out of his dead body. She cowered in a tiny ball against a tree. Even though she would not look, the warmth of her skin told her that he was approaching. She cried out. "Please," he said. "I'm sorry. I never meant to deceive you or hurt you. I have known you since you were born, and I loved you even before then. I have sought you for my entire life. I have left my people behind me forever. I could never approach you as I am, so I hid myself. I wove a skin from your love and bound it together with all of your promises. It was the only way you could ever see me. But you broke one of them, and the thread unraveled. It is gone now, and I too must go. You will never be able to look at me again. I'm sorry, but I want you to believe I did it all out of love." She heard him, and she believed him, and the pain of losing him screamed through her body. She raised her hands to her face and felt the warmth of her tears. She looked at her moist fingertips. Then she clawed out her eyes and turned to face him, blind. She reached out, and he fell into her arms. Parents tell their children of the crazy woman who lives in the forest as a warning for them not to stray too far from the village. They say she went mad and murdered her brother. They say she tore her eyes out from grief. And sometimes they actually see her dancing in the woods, singing, alone, embracing a man who is not there.